little bit more science this morning, Whitey. What do you reckon?
Who doesn't love a bit of science?
Well, you especially. So let's start with the big question. It's the misconception that most people really don't get their head around, because when we talk about the word collagen, people automatically think creams, injections, line fillers, and all like that type of thing. So let's start with the most important thing for everyone to really get their head around. What is collagen, Whitey?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that people actually now know that collagen is in the skin, because I think if we step back 10 years ago, people hadn't even heard of collagen. So I think there's a growing understanding of what it is. But what you have to think is the skin is the largest organ in the body, and fundamentally part of that organ is the connective tissue. And the connective tissue is really important because fundamentally it's like the glue that holds everything together. Probably a better analogy is the fact that it's fundamentally the scaffolding around which tissue is built. And the vast majority of that connective tissue is composed of collagen. So of course, yes, we definitely find it in the skin. We also find it in things like nail and hair. But of course, where else we find it, importantly for us, importantly for active individuals and athletes, is that we find it in muscles, we find it in tendon, and we find it in ligament. So what that tells us is one of two things. One is that clearly it's incredibly important. In fact, collagen makes up a third of total body protein. So a third of the protein in our entire body is composed of collagen. So it tells it how important it is, number one. And then of course, secondly, is that if it starts to become depleted, then it's how important it is that what we do is we top it up and we ensure that we've got enough collagen in order to make sure that we keep the quality and the function of all of those connective tissues from hair, nails, and skin all the way through to muscle, tendon, and ligament.
So you mentioned some really core and key areas of the body here. As you know, my background is in the beauty industry, very much so, as well as being a modern pentathlete, alongside you for many, many years. So we know that between 80 and 90% of the protein that's actually in the skin is type 1 collagen. Now that's the newly formed collagen that's reproducing itself regularly, but it's also reproduced in the connective tissue. Now, if we're talking connective tissue, it's about 40 to 60% in ligaments, tendons, and muscles, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, so it does vary in terms of which type of tissue we're talking about. So obviously from things like cartilage, which we see on articular surfaces. So if you think about the joint and what covers the joint surface on the bone-on-bone contact, all the way through to ligaments and tendons, there's a varying content of collagen. But importantly, it is everywhere. And so making sure that we optimize it and we top it up is absolutely crucial to the function of all of those aspects.
Okay, so we talk about losing collagen as we get older, especially in the beauty industry, but it's more key in the sporting industry. Just before we went live, we're having a conversation about training and how it's so difficult to get back into it, especially after a rest. So we understand that we start to break down collagen with the aging process. And of course, we're all different, we'll vary. Is there a point in time where the aging process or the depletion of collagen really starts to kick in from?
Well, what's interesting about that, Jimbo, is that particularly for those that are very physically active, athletes are an example of that, but actually anybody who's physically active, is that the key process of training is damage. And we spend an awful lot of time trying to reduce that damage, but actually the damage is incredibly important because it's that leads to adaptation. So actually at any age, if you are very physically active, what you're doing is you're constantly breaking down tissue, generally. And so, most of us would understand things like muscle is that what we've got protein, what we call protein turnover on a continual basis. And there's no reason to believe that collagen, which is a protein, is any different to all other types of protein during physical activity. So actually making sure what we're constantly doing is we're constantly breaking down collagen and making sure that we're actually creating an environment inside, so an internal environment, and making sure we're providing enough collagen in order to actually regenerate that collagen is really important from a relatively young age, particularly for young people who are very, very active, much like you and I were when we were training internationally. But certainly, and so you've got that turnover piece, and then laid on top of that, you've actually got this natural reduction in collagen. And interestingly enough, again, that mirrors a natural reduction in protein in general. And that starts to occur from the 20s onwards. And what we see is we see the sort of inexorable decline in collagen as we do with protein. And with protein, we call it a process called sarcopenia. But we see that in collagen, and that reduces at circa 1% per year as we age. Now that you sort of think about it, 1% per year doesn't sound like a great deal, but actually when we start to ramp that up and we combine that with being highly physically active, we can see that could have a significant impact on collagen availability. And then, of course, there are other factors in life, particularly, for example, for women when it comes to things like menopause. And what we know that actually perimenopausal, so during the menopause, we see a reduction of up to 30% of collagen. And that, visibly, we can see that, the great example of that is actually in fine lines and wrinkles of the skin, is that often what women will describe is they see an increase in fine lines and wrinkles perimenopausal, during menopause and postmenopause. And that is fundamentally linked to that rapid reduction in collagen. And of course, it's not only the skin where that is affected, it's all connective tissue which is going to be affected. So the point here, James, I think is that collagen supplementation or optimizing collagen turnover, so collagen resynthesis, of which there are a couple of different ways of doing that, is absolutely crucial, particularly for the very active from a young age across the lifespan.
So I guess that answers for everybody watching this at home or whatever time they're watching, it's that age-old question: do men or women age faster? So technically, it's the female body that's going to age or at least deplete in collagen faster.
I mean, it's a really complex question, Jimbo, because what it runs to, that complexity of question, is what is aging, and critically, how do we measure aging? I think certainly from my perspective, have spent a life in exercise and sports science, is that invariably what we do is we measure it against performance. And certainly what we do if we measure it against things like VO2 max, so maximum aerobic capacity, things like strength, power, and those type of things, then what you see is as we age, we see all of these things parallel each other. So if you reduce protein content, if you reduce collagen content in connective tissue, particularly ligaments and tendons, then what you see is you see a concomitant, at the same time, you see a concomitant reduction in strength and then a reduction in power. And so therefore, because of that, you see a reduction in performance. Now, paralleled with that, we see a reduction in VO2 max as we age. And so therefore, generally what we start to see is that from the sort of mid-20s, maybe a little bit older than that now with the evolution of sports science and sports medicine, but certainly from that sort of 30 period, 30s, we start to see this decline in performance. Now, what's interesting about that decline is somewhat inexorable. It will happen, okay? But what we have been able to do now with that rate of decline is that what we now understand is that by the imposition, by using things like physical training, by using nutrition, by improving our environmental milieu, so by improving our sleep quality, by improving rest and recovery, by improving our diet, reduction in alcohol consumption, the cessation of smoking, all those types of things, is that what we see, instead of it being a very steep reduction in performance, what we can do is we can basically make it quite a bit more shallow. And so what we can do as we age is we can maintain performance, albeit it does start to reduce as we age, but we can still be performing well into our 60s, 70s, 80s. And you and I have seen it in athletes at world age group championships. Incredible to watch their performance. So really what's important is what we do with ourselves. In other words, what we put in our mouths, how we train, all of those things will then dictate in part the rate of decline as we age.
So you mentioned it earlier, collagen being a protein itself, the primary structural protein of the human body, the scaffolding, as you called it, the glue of the human body. So is this testament to the fact that people, especially people who want to stay active, like you and me, and you're building up to yet another incredible Ironman challenge. I'm still competing at a world level in my sport of modern pentathlon that exists still currently.
Yeah, it's current, guys. Yeah.
People can tell this is a very current podcast, but you know, the key thing is here, we still want to perform at a very, very high standard. So are you saying it's absolutely crucial to make sure that the protein content of the body through supplementation here is something we need to focus on?
Well, there's a couple of really interesting points you make there, James. I think number one, it's not just for elite athletes. I think generally for everybody is that what we want to do is we want to improve or at least maintain our performance as we age. You know, it's really important for a whole variety of different things. At one end of the spectrum, it's because it enables us to be able to pick up our kids, to play with our kids in the park, for grandparents to be able to play with their grandchildren. All of those type of things where things like strength and aerobic capacity are really important. Actually, in that population, they're looking to maintain or improve their performance all the way through to the likes of you and I as we age and are competing at world age group championships where we're absolutely trying to smash out performance. So I think across the activity spectrum, it's really important that I think the vast majority of people want to maintain or enhance their performance. So to that end, what we should be doing is making sure that we optimize everything that we do to bring that about. Now, one part of that, one very, very important part of that is nutrition. And I think the second interesting thing that you come to is around supplements, because I think, you know, people listening to this will be thinking, well, why do I need to take supplements? You know, and I think it's absolutely true. I mean, the bottom line, what we're talking about, collagen, is a naturally occurring product. We find it in food sources and a whole variety of different food sources. But the interesting thing is, I think that with modern life, what we've done is that we have altered the way in which we eat. Invariably, diets are relatively poor. They're incredibly highly energy dense, but with very little quality to that. And that's because we live frenetic lives, and you know, we buy ready-made meals. We you know, just the way in which we do it. We don't do what we should do. I think we'd all love to do what we should do, but simply it's very difficult to achieve. So in that, to that end, what it then becomes is really important as a safety net to make sure that what we're taking in terms of supplements is making sure that we're not missing anything out as part of that important nutrition. Which is really important for this performance piece, number one. And I think then number two is also where there is indication to take supplements. And of course, there's no point, what you don't want to do. I mean, I see it so often with athletes who physically rattle as they come into the room because they're taking so many supplements. And I think the problem with that is it's not about the sort of ubiquitous consumption of supplements to enhance performance. What you have to be really targeted. Number one, because if you don't need it, you won't uptake it. And it could be dangerous with certain supplements. And I think secondly, and probably as importantly, is that you'll get very, very expensive urine if you take supplements you really don't need. You know, so this idea that a classic athlete approach is a little is good, so therefore a lot must be better. It's not actually true. So I think what we have done very specifically with You Perform is that we have created a range which answers the question number one about need, about indication, is that we know that collagen is reducing across age. We know that there is collagen turnover when we are highly physically active. And so therefore there is a good reason to have a collagen supplement in different guises. And we can chat about that, the different supplements that we have and what they do and how they perform. Firstly, I think that's really important. And then of course the second thing to that is actually about quality. And what we are, you and I, as people know, are incredibly passionate about is making sure that what people buy from us is the best, and what it says on the tin is in the product. And so I think to my mind, it's one of those things that collagen is so incredibly important. We know it's reducing with age. We know there is a high turnover for those that are physically active. So it should be part of that supplement regime, because it is quite difficult to get enough in the natural diet. You have to be very, very targeted if you're going to get it from the diet. So there is good indication for it. And then making sure that you use you perform is because we are science-led, and we have developed a product which is simply the best. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. And so what you are getting is exactly what you want at the right quantities when you need it.
I think very much so. I mean, to coin a phrase here, we are the most overfed and undernourished population in history. Far too much dependence on convenient fast food, ready meals, which have been created to taste attractive, but actually lack the nutrition that we actually need in our diets.
Yeah, and you know, there's a lovely term that we use now. It's about it's processed, and certainly what we have done is we've evolved to a highly processed environment, and fundamentally, just the way to think about that is that when it's processed, that means things are lost. They're either deliberately taken out, or they just are removed as part of the manufacturing process. And you're absolutely right. Invariably, they are calorie dense, but very poor in nutritional value, because they are highly processed. So, you know, from a very simple perspective, if you are looking to improve your diet, remove as much processed food in that diet as you possibly can. And what that will instantly do is it will enhance the nutrient value of what you're consuming. So it's a very easy step to make. But even then, it can still be complicated by busy lives, family and work, and all of those type of things. And actually, you know, it would be great if we lived in utopia and everybody could eat the right diet. But sadly, that's not always the case.
Well, that brings us really nicely on to protein, because obviously collagen is a source of protein, and there's lots of different sources of protein available to everybody watching this podcast from the supermarket: fish, chicken, eggs, even some green foods have good source of protein, pea protein, for example. And then we're going higher on that spectrum to the specialists like spirulina and chlorella, which are in the active greens, which are 65%, 70%, even 80% protein. Now, collagen hydrolysate and the collagen grades that we use, namely Tenderfort, Verisol, and Fortigel, they are a 96 to 98% pure protein source. Explain to everybody exactly what that means, and how does that compare and contrast against, let's say, a nice piece of steak, for example.
Yeah, and who doesn't like a nice bit of steak? Not everybody, obviously. But
Vegetarians,
you and I, exactly. Yeah, that's true. You and I certainly do. I think, you know, I guess the easiest way to think about it is what we call bioavailability. You know, we've got lots of flash words when it comes to science, but in essence, just think about what's biologically available to you at the gut. So what you put in your mouth is not necessarily what enters the system, because it has to cross a whole host of different barriers. But one is the gut-blood barrier. So it has to come from the stomach and into the blood and then circulate, etc. And of course, that relies upon a whole host of different things: how we break it down, the transit time as it moves through the gut, and all these type of things in order to optimize the environment for uptake. And certainly what we know is that in the natural diet, for example, generally, you know, I mean, rather than getting the specifics, generally we've got about 30% bioavailability from most protein sources, things like meat and chicken and those type of things. And so what that means is that when you're taking in a 10-gram piece of steak, that's not 10 grams of protein you're taking in. I think people often sort of reflect on that as that being wholly protein, and so therefore we're taking the whole of that in as protein, but that's not actually the case. We're taking in circa 30% of that. And so what becomes really important is that as we move away from pure protein sources, so things like, as you've mentioned, fish and chicken and steak and those type of things, as we move towards more plant-based proteins, then what we see is a reduction in availability, or certainly a reduction in protein content. And so because of that, it means we have to eat more of it. So for example, just off the top of my head, something like a 10-ounce piece of steak requires 2.5 kilograms of avocados. Now that's an awful lot of avocados to eat. Number one, incredibly expensive. Number two, incredibly difficult to eat that volume of plant-based material. And then of course number 3 is that along with that you've got a calorie burden, which for some people who are looking to manage weight, and you know, many of us, you and I, are looking to manage weight when it comes to race season, that sort of stuff. It becomes a problem. So to some extent, what we want to do is we want to target sources of protein which give us the greatest bioavailability, the greatest uptake for the lowest calorie burden. So that what we can do is we can fundamentally, you know, it's that classic targeted nutrition, so that we're delivering what we need, but without the other peripherals. Make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Good. It's quite a complex area, really, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And of course, and the other thing to think about is actually, you know, it's actually the type of protein. I'm sure we're going to come on to that now, but the type of protein as well makes a really big difference. So, you know, classically, those proteins that are available in the supermarkets, most of them focus on muscle mass and on muscle. And with that, we know that it's, you know, and invariably you see whey protein being the predominant source of that, because it's high in specific amino acids, things like leucine, which we know are important in turnover of protein, so turnover of muscle, what we call muscle resynthesis. So it is about the type as well. So what you're thinking about is about the quantity, the type, the quality, and the timing of when we take it in. And that timing, again, is where supplements make a really big difference, because it effectively makes it easier to take in the protein at the point at which we really need it.
Well, let's just talk about that, and we can come back to bioavailability and quality of protein in a minute, because I think you've hit a golden nugget there for people watching. Timing of taking in Perform proteins. You mentioned whey. We have that groundbreaking, I'm going to use a phrase of the Aston Martin of sports proteins. It is simply the best on the market, bar none. And it's British.
Absolutely. And James Bond may even use it, who knows?
There we go. But what is the correct timing to use for that protein? It's a question we get asked time and time again. So is it pre, is it post, is it during? What's your recommendations here, Greg?
You know, it's a really interesting question. And I think it becomes, whenever a scientist says an interesting question, it's because they don't really know. Okay. And I think, you know, I guess to some extent, the jury is still out. The scientific jury is still out on the absolute best time to consume protein. And add on top of that, it's from a scientific perspective, but there's also a palatability perspective. You know, can you consume protein at that particular time? And then also there are, you know, a whole host of sort of socio issues around, you know, can you take it? Have you got the facilities to be able to take it? All those sort of things. But I think generally, most people would agree that the best time to take it is immediately post exercise. And the good thing, you know, what that then does by doing it at that point, it then answers all these other different questions. You know, taking large volumes of protein on prior to exercise can be problematic for gut disturbance. So you disturb the gut, that will impact on the performance during training, etc. During training itself, quite difficult to do. Certainly, you know, it depends what training session is and whether you're actually able to take supplements on during that particular period of time. But immediately post exercise, when everything is done, we certainly know some lovely evidence to demonstrate that what we see is we see a greater resynthesis if we take in protein immediately post exercise. Now, of course, what that then points towards is how do we take in protein? Because it's very difficult, as you and I know, after an incredibly hard session, the last thing you want to do is sit down to a nice steak, egg, and chips. Firstly, from a palatability perspective, you just can't do it. But I think secondly, it's just practically, you know, how do you do that within? And when I say immediately post, we're talking sort of within 30 minutes post exercise. So from a practical perspective, and from a muscle turnover, from a protein turnover perspective, it's that immediate post exercise 30-minute window which appears to be the optimal time.
So the rule of thumb is make your protein up, take it to your training session, and then utilize it as soon as you get out of the pool, as soon as you get off that track, whatever the session is. If you're on a bike, put it down then.
Listen, absolutely. I mean, what we're very proud of doing, with UPerform, is that we've created the gel, the active gel, which is just so incredibly convenient. It looks like, most athletes will recognize it as an energy gel. It's not an energy gel, it's a protein gel. But the great thing about that is you throw it in your kit bag, and as soon as you finish, you just tear and consume. So it's fantastic. It's really convenient. You can take it in very rapidly. The great thing about the UPerform protein shake is that for me, that there are multiple different things that we're trying to do, as well as increasing protein intake. And the great thing about our whey is that it includes collagen. So now what we're doing is topping up collagen as well. And also, because we are making it as a fluid, what we are doing is we are increasing our ability to rehydrate post-training. And so fundamentally what we're doing is we're starting the recovery process as soon as we finish the session. And that recovery process will mean that we get greater adaptation to that particular training session. But equally what it means is that we'll come into the next session in a much better shape, so that we can actually hammer out the next active session as well. So there are lots of benefits by making sure that we have the right timing with the right quality, the right quantity, immediately post-exercise.
So let's move on and talk collagen, because there's loads of collagen brands that have now sprung up across the UK especially, but also across the world. And some of them have marine collagen, which is derived obviously from fish skin, and different sources of protein and different sources of collagen. Now, UPerform, we are very, very proud to work with a number of different international bodies, namely one of our manufacturers, which produces these 3 groundbreaking, scientifically proven collagen peptides, namely Verisol, which has been scientifically proved not only for the benefits of the skin, but also to instigate new collagen production in the body, or an improved collagen production in the body by some 65%, which is quite considerable. Tenderfort as well, which is what we use in those gels with the Verisol. So it's the first gel in the world to have 2 different bioactive collagen peptides. And that's really focused towards your connective tissue, your ligaments, tendons, and muscles. And of course, then we've got that 3rd type, which we use in the whey and collagen protein and the tablets, that Fortigel. Now that's focused more towards the cartilage. Now, what's the benefits of utilizing different collagen peptides, and what does the evidence suggest at the moment in time? Because things are changing all the time, but what does the evidence suggest at the moment in time that the rationale for using these 3 peptides is?
Well, it's a really interesting one, James. As you and I well know, the ability to manufacture collagen, to create collagen which we can consume and absorb, is an incredibly new technology. You've been in this area for so long now, and it was into the 2000s before we got to the point where we could actually produce a collagen which was consumable. So to that end, what we know is that the science, to some extent, what science does is, and it's interesting, people often say to me, what do you do? What I say is that I often produce the science which supports what we already know. And we know that through experience. But so the science is sort of catching up with this process. So we're starting to see an increase in the scientific support, the independent scientific support. And that's really important about what we're talking about here. That is supporting the role of collagen, the importance of collagen in a whole host of different areas, whether it comes to skin, nails and hair, or whether we're talking about ligament and tendon. I think, so number one, that is growing. I think probably the important thing, to go back to your initial point, is that the vast majority of that, if not all of that, is focused on collagen which is derived from either chicken or bovine sources. It is not from marine sources. So actually there's very limited evidence to suggest that marine source collagen has the same positive effects that we see from other sources. Now, marine collagen is quite attractive because it's a lot cheaper. But yeah, again, I mean, it is a lot cheaper. But and so therefore, for you and I, what we could have gone for was the marine collagen, because actually the margin on that is much better. We make more money. But that's not what drives us. What drives us is evidence, and what drives us is science. And so therefore, what we've done is we've gone for the more expensive end of that, because it is really important that we are science-led in this. So firstly, what we've done is we use an original source which has what we call efficacy. So it's got research support to it, which is growing on a continual basis. I think when it comes to the specific peptides, again, it brings us back to this idea. I think we sort of, particularly those that athletes that are listening, or those that are very active, will understand that we moved away from the idea that in the 70s we'd eat raw eggs with molasses. And listen, I remember doing it. My brother in particular, was a heavies athlete, he's a strength, he's an international shot put hammer, was an international shot put hammer thrower, would consume raw eggs following a session. And the idea at that point was that protein was protein, so just get as much of it in as you possibly can. And of course, we've evolved massively from that point now. And we now know the specific amino acid that is most valuable in that muscle turnover, and that being leucine. And so that's why we focus on whey protein, which is high in leucine, etc. And so collagen is exactly the same. All collagen is not equal. And I think that's the really important message to hear here. Not only is it about the source it's derived from, but it's also about the peptide that we use. And what we've done is we've worked incredibly hard with the scientists to make sure that we have the right peptides in the right quantities, which are targeting very specific functions in the body. And so again, it comes down to an issue of quality. Is that what you can be assured of, that with Uperform, is what we have done is we have targeted it so that it is of the highest quality in the right quantities, and developed it in such a way that you can take it at the right time. So effectively, everything you look at with Uperform leads to enhancement or optimization of that collagen turnover.
So it's from collagen right through to palatability is what we've addressed over the last years of research before we even got to launch. I remember sitting on my hands getting very frustrated, because we're seeing other brands pop up, and then a nice smile coming on my face when I see the grade of collagen they've actually sourced, thinking and understanding with all the evidence and science that we have access to, that our product is simply going to perform better than theirs. And I think it's a nice way. I try to put this into a very simple term when people ask me why you perform collagen. And my answer to this is, if you have two sprinters on the track on 100 meters, and they both have a personal best of 10 seconds flat, but one's going to race in track spikes and one's going to race in trainers, which one are you going to back? It's as simple as that. They're both going to go fast, but one's going to go a whole lot faster and perform a whole lot better.
And on that as well, James, is to extrapolate that, the spikes might cost a little bit more, but the question is, what do you want? Do you want to save money, or do you want to enhance performance? Yeah. And so critically, for us, it is yes, it does cost a little bit more, but it costs a little bit more for a very good reason. That is because it is absolutely the best. Yes,
very much so. I'm going to bring you back a little bit. We talked about protein sources, and we talked about aging. We talked about loads of different places in the body where you find the protein, the collagen protein, the skin predominantly, which is where, I've been focused for many, many years, but also ligaments, tendons, and cartilage. But what about this thing you mentioned, menopause, and then bringing that onto bone? Because I understand that the largest protein in bone is collagen, and actually bone is significantly protein. So
about 80% of bone is protein.
Wow. Okay.
So and it's one of those things we sort of think, well, it must be. I guess to some extent it's because people's experience of what the bone is they see it dried out in skeletons hanging up on the rack. You sort of think, well, it's just just looks like, classically people say, oh, it's chalk, it's calcium phosphate, and so it's just chalk. But of course it's not. It's a living organism that has both a neural, so it's got nerves attached to it, but it's also got a blood flow to it, and it's incredibly, and it's growing and repairing on a constant basis. And of course, what we know with, I spent many years as director of research at the British Olympic Medical Centre, and we have this particular problem at the time that we called the female athlete triad. That has now been renamed, quite rightly so, to what we call Red S, because it doesn't just affect females, it affects male athletes as well. And invariably what that's about is it's about an imbalance between calorie consumption and calorie expenditure. Is that what we find with athletes is they're expending huge levels of calories with training. And particularly in endurance-based athletes, is what they're trying to do is manage their weight, because there is this it's an interesting belief, because to some extent there is truth which sits beneath it, and that is that lighter is faster. But of course, lighter is only faster if you can maintain strength, power, VO2 max, and performance. It's not in isolation. If I get lighter, I'll just go faster. And of course, by calorie restricting in that fashion, what you then also do is you see an impact, a negative impact on the immune function. So you get immune dysfunction. We've published an awful lot of work in that area as well. But also for females, what they see is that there is a disturbance in the hormonal milieu, which can lead to a reduction in estrogen and can lead to variability or an alteration in the menstrual cycle. So they go from what we call eumenorrheic, so normal menstrual cycle, into things like oligomenorrheic, or they can actually end up at what we call amenorrheic, so they lose their menstrual cycle completely. Now that is sort of the external representation of what's going on internally, but that reduction in estrogen also leads to a reduction in bone mineral density, and that bone mineral density becomes what we call osteopenia, so low bone mineral density, which can then develop into osteoporosis, but certainly we see a reduction. Interesting enough, our work back in the early 2000s, we did a whole host of work with male endurance athletes and saw exactly the same thing, as we saw low bone mineral density in male athletes. So it's an interesting one, because there are lots of different things going on, and obviously bone is absolutely critical to the human structure, and making sure that we optimize bone health is really important. And of course, what we know with women in particular is that not only physical activity and calorie restriction makes a big difference to that, but of course the menopause, and when we go through the menopause, we often see a reduction in estrogen, which is why we have HRT, or part of the reason why we have HRT post-menopausal. But that process then leads to a reduction in bone mineral density and can lead to osteopenia in later life. So again, it's crucial that what we do is that we maintain our protein intake to optimize the structure and function of a whole variety of different connective tissues, bone being very important at that. And of course, one of the key proteins in that is collagen. And that's why collagen in the diet is so important.
So to give everyone a quick recap, we've got 3 different collagen peptides. That's the Verisol and the Tenderfoot in the incredible active gels. We've got the Fortigel with the whey in the incredible proteins. That's the strawberry and the chocolate. And then we've got the Fortigel on its own in the tablets. I think that gives people watching us today a really good insight into the importance of protein, the importance of collagen, and what they can potentially do about it. Now, you and me are going to do one more of these things. I believe in very, very shortly. So, Greg, once again, thank you very much for everything. It's been fascinating listening to you. I learn every single time you open your mouth, my friend.
Well, you're very kind. You're very kind, Joe. It's always great to chat with you, mate. And do you know what? I am just so excited of what we've done here with YouPerform. I mean, it really is. I'll tell you what runs through the DNA of YouPerform is yours and my passion for enhancing performance, and I hope that people see that, and that's why it's the product for everybody.
Very much so. Greg, train hard. Speak to you soon.
Always. Cheers. Take care.